1942 is a bit of an oddity. Shooters were, and still are, a very popular genre in Japan, but most of them took place in the distant future, in space. A shooter set in World War II was not common at all back in the 1980s. Even stranger, a game developed by a Japanese developer set in the Pacific Theater where you fly what appears to be an American fighter plane on a quest to shoot down and destroy the entire Japanese Air Force. Capcom has its roots in a company called I.R.M, which was founded in 1979 by Kenzo Sugimoto. If that reminds you of another arcade powerhouse, it should. Sugimoto originally founded I.R.M Corporation, you know, the R-Type people, back in 1974. I.R.M had a subsidiary, Japan Capsule Computers Company. And it was these two divisions that eventually spawned what we know today as Capcom, which was a truncation of Capsule Computers back in 1983. Capcom originally existed to distribute electronic game machines, but its first actual video game was 1984's Vulgus. 1942 was released in December of 1984 and became one of the first bona fide hits for Capcom. It was also one of the first Capcom arcade games to spawn any kind of sequel. This could have something to do with the game's director, Yoshiki Okamoto. Although 1984 was his first year at Capcom, he came to the company with a couple of hits already under his belt. Before joining Capcom, Okamoto produced the shooters Time Pilot and Gyrus for Konami. However, despite those hits, he was terminated by Konami for a variety of reasons, one of which was apparently that he'd been asked to create a driving game rather than shooters. Okamoto was a bit of a hitmaker. Some of the games his name is attached to are Final Fight, Street Fighter II, and Resident Evil. During my days at Electronic Gaming Monthly, I heard a great story about this game that I really hope is true. Like I said at the beginning of this review, a shooter developed by a Japanese publisher where you fly an American fighter plane against the Japanese Air Force in World War II seems like it would have been kind of offensive. Remember, it had only been a generation since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The story goes that protest over the game resulted in Okamoto being forced to give an apology for the creation of 1942, which apparently sated the protesters. Of course, he was in the middle of creating a sequel called 1943 when he gave the apology. I'm sure that went over really well. 1942 definitely shows its age. It's a very straightforward shooter with a simplistic power-up system and wave after wave of enemies that almost seem to appear randomly. The NES version was the very first game published by Capcom on a home console. And like all of its early games, it was ported by the infamous Micronix development studio, which explains the constant flickering and generally lackluster presentation. Even this version of 1942 holds a special place in my heart. When I was a kid, my dad never really showed the least bit of interest in video games. Even though they were a big part of my life, they had no place in his. That is, except for 1942. If and when we ever came across one of these machines, usually in a pizza place or a motel during a car trip, my dad would stop and drop some quarters. To this day, over 30 years later, he still asks if I might have a copy of 1942 lying around.